Audiobook of Contrasting Identities, Navigating Identity Politics Conversations. Introduction. There is a concept in the political world that attracts much hostility among both its proponents and critics. That concept is identity politics. This will be the core focus of this book. So from this point on, identity politics will be referred to as IP. In this book, I will begin by responding to common objections against IP made in the public sphere. Most of these objections will be from a group that has come to be known as the Intellectual Dark Web, IDW. This is because the members of this group, despite having different political positions, seem to be unified by a shared disdain towards IP. I'll argue that most of these objections are based on misunderstandings of IP as a political concept. I will also address how public application of IP by its proponents, who are sometimes called identitarians, also involve misunderstandings. And these misunderstandings are what aids the objection by their critics. In addition, I will respond to leftist criticisms of IP, because although some members of the IDW do not self-identify as right-wing, most of their objections are consistent with that side of politics. One example of such sentiments of IP comes from neuroscientist and author Sam Harris, 2017, who says, "Becoming a part of a movement doesn't help anybody think clearly. So I distrust identity politics of all kinds. I think we should talk about specific issues, whether it's trade or guns or immigration or foreign interventions or abortions or anything else." Another comes from political commentator Ben Shapiro, 2018, who argues, "The way this identity politics works is that how we now judge you not by the content of your character, but by the color of your skin. We are supposed to discern whether your view is good or bad, not by what you have to say, but simply by who you are." Similar has been said by clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson, 2018, who argues, "I think anyone who plays identity politics, whether they play it on the right or the left, is going to pay for it in ways they can hardly imagine. It's a very counterproductive way of dividing up the world. It's impossible to come to a peaceful solution in the identity politics universe." And finally, host of the Rubin Report, Dave Rubin, 2017, who says, "Identity politics only works if you believe the most important quality of us are the attributes we are born with, thus cannot change, rather than the ideas which we come to learn. I view this twisted ideology as a true existential danger for the tolerant and liberal, albeit flawed country that America is." Once the objections have been addressed, I'll offer an approach to IP that resolves both the objections raised by its critics and the misunderstandings stemming from its proponents. This approach is a philosophical theory known as contrastivism. I'll argue that the application of contrastivism will provide an answer to why there is so much division surrounding IP. And from answering this question, contrastivism can allow for a more unified approach to social justice. I will now provide a short summary of what will be covered in each chapter of this book. Chapter 1 will cover the definition of IP, its origins of a concept, and how it is currently understood today. From this definition, I'll put forward a set of criteria of what counts as IP, so that we can easily distinguish IP from non-IP. I'll also clarify what is meant by identity in a political context. The context I will apply in this book will be the ascriptive sense of identity, which says aspects about a person that situates them into particular places in society, normally places an advantage or disadvantage. Chapter 2 will discuss two kinds of knowledge, descriptive and acquainted knowledge. I'll argue that acquainted knowledge can only be attained by experiencing it ourselves, and that this kind of knowledge is important when attempting to gain knowledge. I'll also argue that acquainted knowledge can be extended to groups as well as individuals based on the approximation of their shared experiences. Chapter 3 will respond to an objection against a form of IP known as intersectionality. This objection is that this form places people in hierarchical order of oppression. Hence, it makes people from different groups compete against one another in the oppression Olympics. I'll argue that intersectionality was coined as a concept to address more essentialist versions of IP, thus combats oppression Olympics instead of enforcing it. I'll also point out that the examples of intersectionality being oppression Olympics are actually essentialist IP, not intersectional. Chapter 4 addresses the political philosophy of individualism and the belief of treating all human beings equally, regardless of group membership. I describe this as universal humanism. In this chapter, I'll argue that one can consistently place value on special relationships in group membership, whilst caring a great deal about other human beings. Furthermore, I will claim that when groups have a shared relationship based on disadvantage or harm, that this is an entirely legitimate application of empathy through special relationships. Chapter 5 will respond to the accusation that race-based IP is racist. This is usually done by citing Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, where he hopes that one day people will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This quote has been used to claim that MLK Jr. hoped for all races not acknowledge any differences between individuals of different races. Here I will provide quotes by MLK Jr. and interviews as to challenge the assumption that MLK Jr. would have been against IP. I'll argue that in other writings and interviews he expressed specific disadvantages experienced by African Americans that white Americans did not possess, and campaigned for African Americans to be proud of being black. Hence, MLK Jr. was never advocating denial or ignorance of one's racial identity. Chapter 6 focuses on freedom of speech as a topic. In this chapter, I covered the distinction between positive freedom of speech and negative freedom of speech. I'll argue that a balance between these kinds of freedom maximizes the utility that comes from freedom of speech. From this, I argue that IP maximizes the positive aspect of free speech by seeking out individuals that possess shared experiences based on their group membership. Chapter 7 will cover how appealing to the acquainted knowledge possessed by individuals based on group identity assists us in maximizing our ability to gain descriptive knowledge. This is done by appealing to evidence of businesses that have greater efficiency and productivity when they have greater diversity. I'll also cite governments that have had changes in policy and budget priorities once gender quotas have been introduced. This is used to respond to the claim made by IDW member Dave Rubin that the only diversity that matters is the one of ideas, not of identity. Chapter 8 discusses how to understand concepts related to IP, such as white male privilege. In this chapter, I put forward that acknowledging one's privilege is a demonstration of virtuous character and need not require one to feel guilty, thus responding to claims that IP demands white men ought to feel guilty all the time. However, I'll argue that privilege checking was always intended to be a self-reflective exercise, not something to be used as an accusation or to dismiss arguments. That said, I will also in this chapter explain that privileges based on race, gender, and class do exist, and that rejection of privilege amounts to rejecting facts one merely feels uncomfortable with acknowledging. Chapter 9, I will make the case that economic class ought to be included as an identity group in IP. This argument is made due to that many will make class issues and identity issues as distinct from one another. However, I will claim that the nature of class struggle is consistent with IP, and that the origins of IP always assumed economic class to be included in the application of IP. It is also in this chapter where I'll respond to Jordan Peterson's accusations of oppressor versus oppressed narrative as an explanation of IP as what he calls cultural Marxism. In Chapter 10, I'll respond to an objection by Adolf Reed, who argues that IP enforces neoliberalism and undermines socialist endeavours. My response will be that Reed's objections are legitimate towards non-intersectional IP, such as race and gender reductionism. However, an intersectional IP that includes class as one of the intersectional identities resolves these issues. Chapter 11 will introduce the philosophical concept of contrastivism. In this chapter, I will analyze how the concept is applied by philosopher Walter Sinnott-Armstrong regarding the philosophical problem of knowledge. Once Sinnott-Armstrong's contrastivism is analyzed, I'll make amendments to its limitations and explain how I'll apply my version of his contrastivism. Chapter 12 will apply contrastivism to all the common identities associated with IP, such as race, gender, and class. I'll also apply contrastivism to descriptive knowledge, acquainted knowledge, shared experiences, oppression, disadvantage, and privilege. In addition, I'll apply relevance to all of these contrast classes to conclude that economic class is the overarching social issue of most relevance. From this, emphasizing the shared experiences of class struggle whilst also acknowledging the existence of race and gender as intersections with class struggle is the best way to apply IP. Also, I'll also highlight the existence of being human as overlapping and whilst not necessarily the essential identity group, contains the most significant issue facing all of us from that standpoint: climate change. Chapter 13, the final chapter, will argue that the future of IP must treat economic class as an overlapping identity group, since it exists as an intersection throughout most of the other identities, such as race, gender, and LGBTQIA+. This way we can recognize the nuanced differences of experiences by multiple groups, whilst also illuminating their shared experience through class struggle. However, I'll also repeat that being human still overlaps as a common identity and that climate change is a threat to all of us.